Okay, here's the representative cast of characters for today's show. I mentioned last time that Juvenal and Pliny the Younger were members of the Silver Age of Roman letters, and Tacitus is the most important historian of that period. He's important for a lot of reasons. For one, as I mentioned last time, he's one of the first, if not the first, non-Christian to write about Christians, and he's also one of the earliest important sources, as we'll see, to write about the Britons and the Germans. We'll hear a lot more about Hadrian today also. He was a great traveler, and we'll visit Britain and see his wall there, and also see a little of some other far-flung parts of the empire as they looked in the 2nd century A.D. Hadrian's successor was Antoninus Pius, who isn't well known, but whose temple in the Forum is one of the most prominent and well-preserved buildings still standing there. His successor was Marcus Aurelius, the last of the emperors in what Gibbon calls the happiest century in human history. Will Durant calls his Meditations, that you can still buy in any bookstore, the fifth gospel, but we'll see that that's a bit misleading. Now, as the 2nd century is sometimes called the century of the good emperors, the 3rd century is sometimes called the century of the bad emperors, and Commodus, the spoiled son of Marcus Aurelius, is sort of a prelude to it. From the accession of Commodus in 180 to the accession of Diocletian in 285, there are about 32 emperors and 28 were assassinated. And one of those who wasn't assassinated was hit by lightning. Gibbon says the decline and fall of the Roman Empire began with Commodus. Not all of the emperors in the 3rd century were bad, however, and Aurelian, who only reigned about 5 years, is remembered as one of the more impressive figures of the age, and built the wall around Rome, most of which still stands to this day. Okay, with this list in mind, we'll get started. Last time at the end of the lecture, I was talking about the reign of Hadrian, one of the more interesting of the emperors of Rome. He was a great admirer of things Greek thought and art, an important poet.
He is also said to have been at least the builder and maybe the actual architect in the more narrow sense of the Temple of Venus in Roma.
Between the Forum and the Colosseum, this picture was taken from the top of the ladder looking west. This was the largest temple ever to be built in the city, about 450 feet by 330 feet. The main part of the building sat on the platform you can see in this picture, and on the north and south there were covered passageways with colonnades. In the center were two back-to-back apses for the goddesses, Venus and Roma. You can see the one on the east side in this picture, the one facing west, has been incorporated in effect into the Church of San Francesco Romana. An apse in this context is just a large building-size architectural niche for a statue or an altar, something like that. The term apse applied to later Christian architecture to the churches of the Middle Ages can refer to the whole east end of the church. This arrangement of apses back-to-back is puzzling, and it has been suggested that there is a sort of pun on the names of the temple's two goddesses involved. Venus was always highly regarded in Rome as the mother of Aeneas, who was considered the real founder of Roman civilization, but she is also, of course, the goddess of love, and in Latin, love is amor, which is Roma spelled backwards, whence the back-to-back apses. This is not a theory I made up. I read it somewhere in the work of a man who probably no longer teaches at a major university. Hadrian loved to travel and probably often came and went through the port at Ostia, about 15 miles west of Rome at the mouth of the Tiber. You see it here from the air. In Republican times, the main ports used by the Romans were far south at Puteoli and Naples, and this was inconvenient. Things had to be brought up the roads, up the Appian Way to the city. In Augustus's day, however, a serious effort was begun to keep Ostia open as a port because it was so much closer. The problem was that the Tiber brought down so much silt that the harbor had to be constantly maintained or it would simply fill up and vanish. and eventually it did vanish when the energy and will of the Romans were no longer sufficient to keep it open. By the early Middle Ages, Ostia was a ghost town. In his day, Hadrian's day, the docks were about where the arrow is, and now you can barely see the water in the distance more than a mile away from its former shoreline. Here you can see the restored theater of Augustus's day. There is a curious survival of the former importance of the city in the tradition of the church. The Bishop of Ostia is the head of the College of Cardinals
to this day and gets to announce the winner of the papal election from the balcony of St. Peter's.
This despite the fact that he has essentially no parishioners in his diocese. He is also one of the 7 cardinal bishops, the highest ranking cardinals, and the Bishop of Portus is another. Portus was a kind of adjunct to Ostia on the north, where Fiumicino Airport is now. When the archaeologists came to Ostia in the 19th century, they were faced with something more like a Mayan ruin in the Yucatan than a buried city like Pompeii. Ostia was never buried in the sense that Pompeii was. It was just abandoned to Mother Nature. At Pompeii, one has a chance to see magnificent villas and mansions, but Ostia was more of a blue-collar working man's town, and 60% of the surviving buildings were apartment houses like this one, which was originally 4 stories high. Usually, the ground floor in a building like this was given over to shops. Shops like this one, which has the air about it of a sort of fast food franchise. There is perfectly preserved a marble bar at the left extending out to the street so that businessmen on their way to the forum of the corporations could just grab a quick decaf latte or something like that. A cafe in a port like Ostia would have had to deal with a pretty polyglot clientele, and the thought is that instead of printed menus that few could have read even in Latin, pictures of food were put up so that customers could just point at what they wanted. For example, it looks like this place is offering parsnips, turnips, and a glass of water. Right, just what one imagines longshoremen wanting for lunch. I don't think so. Maybe the pictures were just decoration, I don't know. This is the temple called the Capitolium in Ostia, dedicated to the so-called Capitoline Triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans did often put temples up on a platform like this in a way that is vaguely reminiscent of the way in which this was done in ancient Mesopotamia. The Maison Carrée in Nîmes is another example of this kind of thing, which we'll see shortly. So respect was paid, certainly, to the traditional Roman state divinities. There may have been a few Christians in Ostia in Hadrian's day.
And by the 3rd century, there was certainly a considerable Christian presence. St. Augustine's mother, St. Monica, died here on her way to North Africa with Augustine. And what is possibly the oldest synagogue outside Israel is also to be found here. You can see the image of a menorah above on the left.
But the religious life of the place was probably dominated by the worship of Mithraism.
There are some connections between Zoroastrianism and Mithraism as it was practiced in the Roman Empire, but it's now usually argued that the latter was essentially an independent development. The image most often associated with it depicts Mithras sacrificing a bull with some other animals present, whose significance we don't have time to go into. There have been several Mithraeums like this one excavated at Ostia, and they are to be found all over the ancient Roman world. The main thing that made the cult popular was a convincing claim that following its rituals could lead to life eternal. There were 7 grades of initiation that believers passed through, represented by the symbols on this pathway at Ostia, but exactly what all this involved is not clear. There was no catechism of Mithraism. The popularity of Mithraism almost certainly influenced some Christian practices. most famously the celebration of the birth of Mithras on December 25th, which was picked as the day on which to celebrate the birth of Christ. Mithras was also associated with the sun, and Sun Day was especially important to his followers. After the legalization of Christianity in the 4th century, the popularity of Mithraism waned rapidly. I think two things likely contributed to this, at least two. One is the fact that no women were admitted, and paradise without women would lack something. Anyone could go to a Christian church also: beggars, thieves, women, telemarketers. Also, Mithraism did not proselytize in the way the Christians did, nor, I might add, did Judaism. There were no Jewish missionaries going off to Africa and the Far East.
This is the so-called form of the corporations at Ostia. It has the offices of various import businesses, which had warehouses at the docks. The addresses of the offices here are in the form of symbols, such as you can see in the surviving pebble mosaics. We're going to hear an interesting piece of music now while we see a little more of Ostia, some more of these pebble mosaics and other things. The hymn To the Sun, which survives in Greek and in the sort of alphabetical musical notation the ancient Greeks developed, is, barring some very speculative attributions of surviving fragments to various Greek playwrights, the earliest piece of music we can really at all definitively connect with an actual composer's name. He's Mesomedes of Crete,
who was, at least for a time, a member of what I guess we can call Hadrian's staff or household. The performance is based on a manuscript which belonged to Vincenzo Galilei, who was devoted to the study of early music. He was the father of Galileo Galilei.
The subject, the sun, makes the work sound like it may have been inspired by Mithraism, but it doesn't seem to have been of a ritualistic or liturgical character. This is the floor of the baths of the taxi drivers union. You can see them in their carts there. The floor of the baths of Neptune, that's Neptune's wife Amphitrite. Fine marble courtyard floor still surviving at Ostia. The Decumanus, the main east-west road through the city. This is a model of the Villa of Hadrian at Tivoli, east of Rome. Herbert Muller calls it something like the world's fairgrounds for its day because a lot of the parts were inspired by things Hadrian had seen in various parts of the empire. Hadrian was a Stoic in that he tried to model his philosophical outlook on the views of Zeno the Stoic, who was an Athenian thinker of around 300 BC. He's called Zeno the Stoic because he liked to philosophize in the stoas or covered shopping malls in Athens. A large part of the villa complex was taken up by an Athenian-style stoa with an ornamental pool in the center that you can see in this model. Zeno didn't write anything that survives, but his ideas are found in the so-called Manual of Epictetus, which itself is a sort of compendium of something like lecture notes put together by Arrian. Both Arrian and Epictetus were contemporaries of Hadrian. Arrian also wrote the best-selling biography of Alexander the Great, to which I referred last quarter. Here you can see what survives of the Stoa at Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. Stoicism is often contrasted with Epicureanism, the view of Epicurus, Zeno's contemporary in Athens. Today we think of people like Wolfgang Puck as Epicureans. We associate Epicureanism with the love of things like food and wine. Originally, however, there wasn't as much difference between Stoicism and Epicureanism as one might suppose. Epicurus did advocate the pursuit of pleasure, but moderate pleasure. He emphasized the danger of trying to go too far in this, and for him really the most important thing was not so much the enjoyment of extreme pleasure, but rather the avoidance of extreme pain. The 18th century French philosopher Fontenelle put the real Epicurean point of view well, I think, when he said that the biggest barrier to happiness is the desire to be too happy. With the pursuit of extreme pleasure goes the danger of extreme pain. This is the so-called Maritime Theater now on the grounds of Hadrian's villa. The Pirelli Tire people sponsored the reconstruction restoration of this for only one reason I can think of. It sort of looks like a wheel. It sort of looks like a tire here, I guess. As I say, it's called the Maritime Theater, but no one really knows what it was for. It looks like a kind of island getaway surrounded by a moat. For the Stoic, the idea wasn't so much to pursue pleasure or avoid pain, but rather to be content in any situation. This sort of contentment could be achieved by submission to fate and the power of the mind. The idea is that fate has assigned each of us a role, and our job is to be content in that role, and the mind has the power to bring this contentment about. If you substitute God for fate, you get one of the basic tenets of Christianity, as well as one of the basic tenets of many other religions, it's true. When Dante says, Nella sua volontate e nostra pace, in thy will is our peace, he's expressing the Stoic point of view, as is Milton when he says, the mind is its own place and can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. Edwin Dyer, the contemporary of Shakespeare, says, my mind to me a kingdom is. Richard Lovelace says, stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Minds peaceful and quiet, take that for an hermitage. This is all pure Stoicism. Be ye emperor or street sweeper, happiness lies in being content with your role and in mental control. This is the so-called Pool of Canopus, inspired by an Alexandrian precedent. You can see another example here of the Hadrianic Arch, which is used, as I said, for decorative purposes to highlight something rather than as an engineering device. It does seem, however, that it would be easier to be an emperor Stoic than a street sweeper Stoic. Ah, yes, I'm content with my role as emperor. You street sweepers should follow my example, and you too can achieve tranquility. It also encourages political and social conservatism. Everyone should stay in his place. This is a view of the baths at the Villa of Hadrian. This is sort of like the imperial hot tub, I guess. I'm reminded of an interview I saw once with Anthony Quinn on some show like Lifestyles of the Rich and Decadent. He was smoking a big cigar, lolling in a swimming pool on the Riviera, and the interviewer was saying how nice it must be to be rich and live in the lap of luxury. The late Mr. Quinn just took a big puff on his cigar and said, money isn't everything. That's probably what Hadrian would have said too, but talk's cheap. This is the so-called Cryptoporticus now, one of the biggest surviving pieces of the villa of uncertain purpose. Though this is an oversimplification, essentially one could be a rich Stoic with a clear conscience, just as one could be a rich Jew of the Old Testament period with a clear conscience, though for somewhat different reasons. The rich Stoic can say, Some are destined to be poor, some rich, and mental control should make all equally content. Marcus Aurelius says that his stoicism helped him to be indifferent to the fate of his suffering soldiers because of this. The rich Old Testament Jew could have a clear conscience, thinking that his wealth was a reward for his virtue in God's favor. The poor must have displeased God, so it was no business of his. It was up to them to get right with Yahweh. Again, as I said, this is an oversimplification. One can certainly quote passages in the Old Testament which would conflict with this, and obviously by the time the book of Job was written, it's clear that there was some confusion about exactly how the Lord rewarded and punished. Here's another view of the grounds of Hadrian's villa now as they look today. One could argue that there is a sort of movement, not to say progress, from the Old Testament Jewish position that God rewards the just, to the questioning of this view in books like Job and Ecclesiastes. Then the Stoic, and the author of Ecclesiastes could pretty much pass for one, comes along and says, it's true that God works in mysterious ways, but the key to happiness lies in playing the role we've been assigned and not worrying about whether we seem to be getting what we deserve or not from our point of view. For the Old Testament Jew and the Stoic, however, the curtain goes down on the play at death. If you die in the knowledge you have lived the right way, that has to be pretty much its own reward. But then the Christian comes along and says, but if you believe as we do, that life is not a play but a rehearsal, that how you do in this rehearsal or test determines how you spend eternity, that's a different thing altogether. The test isn't so easy, though. If you take Jesus literally, love thy neighbor as thyself, sell all that thou hast and give it to the poor, if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. That's tough. At the end of his Meditations, written from the Stoic perspective, Marcus Aurelius says, don't worry, in a little while you'll be nobody and nowhere like Trajan and Hadrian. That Stoic conclusion, frankly, hard as the Christian test may be, isn't as appealing as eternity in paradise. Quite a few works of art that once decorated Hadrian's villa still survive, like this centaur in the Capitoline Museum. As I've said, Roman sculpture is not usually thought to be quite up to the standards of the Greeks. One critic has said that Roman works are like the sculptural equivalent to robots, but that hardly seems fair. One problem we have, to mention this important point again, is that Roman sculptors are almost a completely anonymous bunch. There's hardly a single work of Roman sculpture surviving that we can connect with the name of an artist. And this contributes to the view that they were somehow mass-produced, which certainly isn't so. At least this is hard to imagine as a kind of factory work just stamped out of a mold or something.
This is in fact signed, but in Greek, not Latin. The fellows' names are Aristeas and Papias, and the inscription says they worked in Aphrodisias in Asia Minor, which was in at least the farther reaches of Hadrian's empire, but a long way from Italy. We'll hear more about it later. It is thought likely that the so-called drunken faun, or Fauno Rosso, also from Hadrian's villa, was made by the same sculptors, who may have made these as copies of earlier Hellenistic pieces, but it's hard to know about that kind of thing. Whether or not all this qualifies Aristeas and Papias to be called Roman sculptors is up to you.
One of the most impressive things to survive from Hadrian's villa is this little mosaic, which could almost pass for a painting. It's only about a foot or so on a side, but it has 250,000 pinhead-sized tesserae marble chips in it. The later glass cube mosaics in places like Ravenna are more celebrated than this kind of earlier Roman work, but marble chip mosaics like this are often truly astounding. Some of you may remember seeing the Battle of Issus mosaic from Pompeii last quarter, which is the most famous such work. Hadrian was a homosexual, and when his companion Antinous died in a boating accident on the Nile, the emperor had statues honoring him put up all over the empire. This is one of those works which was, in fact, sort of mass-produced, but it is still better than we could probably mass-produce today, certainly. As I said, Hadrian would sometimes have come and gone through Ostia, but he also, of course, spent a lot of time on Roman roads, and by his day there were 50,000 miles of paved ones in the Roman Empire. This is the way the Appian Way looks today, and it is the first road the Romans laid out, going to the south all the way back in the 4th century BC. It has been paved and repaved in some places over the centuries because it's been in constant use. You can still drive down it today. In some places, the original basalt blocks of the roadbed still make up the surface, and as you can see here, have been rutted by wheels made long before the days of Goodrich and Goodyear, Firestone and Pirelli. The Appian Way goes south, but in the early 120s, Hadrian headed north, and we're going to visit some of the places he did now. In Verona, the capital of Cisalpine Gaul at the time, that is Gaul on this side, Cis, this side of the Alps, essentially the area between the Po and the Alps, the arena which you see here was probably under construction at the time he arrived. It's the 5th largest the Romans ever built, and unlike the Colosseum, which is the largest, the one in Verona here is still in use. Aida's performed here every summer, for example. Hadrian could have seen a performance in the Roman theater that still survives here too. Roman drama, however, is not highly regarded. We only have works by 2 early comedians, Plautus and Terence, and 1 tragedian, Seneca, surviving. And they are not in the same class as the Greeks like Aristophanes and Sophocles. By the 2nd century AD, these theaters were probably used more for things like vaudeville shows than serious drama. So if Hadrian spent any time here, he probably saw something more like Saturday Night Live than Masterpiece Theater. In Arles across the Alps in Gaul, France to us, he could also have seen this amphitheater, probably under construction as well. The word arena comes from the Latin word for sand. Sand was used to cover the floors of these buildings. The word amphitheater means round theater. Both words, arena and amphitheater, are used to refer to buildings like this. Hadrian's favorite poet among his contemporaries was a fellow from Arles named Favorinus. As I think I mentioned earlier, Hadrian himself was a sort of poet, and one of his poems is occasionally found in anthologies of Roman literature. It begins, Animula vagula blondula hospes comesque corporum quae nunca bibis in loca, which can sort of be translated or paraphrased, my poor little wandering soul, companion of my body, where are you going to go when I die? This is not really a Stoic thought. It sounds to me like Hadrian was ripe for a conversation with some Christians. Here you are inside the walls of the arena at Arles. The Romans built these without mortar, even though they knew all about concrete, which they used extensively in other sorts of buildings. Legend has it that the friends of Favorinus criticized him for not being more critical of Hadrian's poetry, but his response was, when a man commands 30 legions, he can write poetry any way he wants. Which reminds me of one of Winston Churchill's good lines. As Prime Minister of England, I can say that there are some rules of grammar up with which I will not put. This is the amphitheater in Nîmes, west of Arles, across the Rhone as it looks today. And like the one in Arles, too, it is still in use. Hadrian's successor, Antoninus Pius, was born in Nîmes, which, as I said last week, will make him the third emperor in a row to be born outside Italy. Trajan and Hadrian were both born in Spain. Another of the most well-preserved of all Roman buildings is in Nîmes, the so-called Maison Carrée, or square building. This looks a lot like the Capitolium at Ostia once did, the building we saw the ruins of earlier, with the temple proper on top of a platform with a colonnade at the front and the enclosed section at the back. It was built in the 1st century AD to honor Agrippa, Augustus's famous son-in-law, and his sons. Agrippa is universally admired by historians and contributed a lot to making Gaul a civilized place. Remember, it's his name that Hadrian put up on the front of the Pantheon. Nîmes was supplied with water via the famous Pont de Gard aqueduct, which ran from a reservoir in the mountains to the east 30 miles to the city. Pliny the Younger, the fellow I mentioned earlier in connection with the early Christians in Nicaea, calls the aqueducts the kind of things the Romans had the most right to take pride in, and they are tremendous accomplishments that wouldn't be easy to duplicate today. The Pont de Gard aqueduct, for example, required surveying a line that would slope just the right amount from the height of the reservoir to the level of the city 30 miles away. The water flowed through a sort of trough at the top level. There was a major problem with aqueducts, though, that was similar to that faced by the port at Ostia. Unless these aqueducts were constantly maintained over a period of time, the water in them would produce enough deposits to close the pipes up. Like the arenas, the aqueducts were usually built without mortar, by the army typically in its spare time. Many of the aqueducts around Rome are still in use today, especially the underground ones in the city itself. Just up the Rhone is the city of Orazio, or Orange. Here you can see what is perhaps the most well-preserved theater to survive from the whole of classical antiquity. Built in Agrippa's day in the 1st century AD, it still has its skene, or stage building, almost completely intact. That word, skene, incidentally, is the origin of our word scene. The seats of a lot of theaters survived, but few have any of the actual skene left. Lyon, with a population of 200,000, was the largest city in Gaul at the time Hadrian visited it, and it still has a lot of Roman remains, including a large theater built in Augustus's day, probably under the administration of Agrippa, his son-in-law. Hadrian enlarged this, and he ordered the building of the smaller Odeon also for things like musical performances. The French consider Vercingetorix, who was defeated in his war with Julius Caesar back in the 1st century BC, a hero, but it is sometimes argued that this defeat actually gave the French a sort of head start in the battle for cultural supremacy north of the Alps. It is certainly possible to defend the claim that France did become the most civilized country in Europe in the Middle Ages, but the connections between this and the Roman conquest are pretty difficult to sort out. This is more or less what Paris looked like in the 2nd century AD, but Hadrian probably didn't visit it. In his day, it was still called Lutetia, or Mudville, which doesn't have quite the same ring to it as Paris. Had the name not been changed to Paris after the Parisii, the local Gallic tribe, I don't think it would have ever amounted to much. No one would have wanted the capital of France to be Mudville. No one would have wanted to buy the latest fashions from Mudville. As you can see, almost the entire city was on the left bank, south of the Seine. The Cardo, the main north-south street, still survives under the modern Rue Saint-Jacques. The main east-west street, the Decumanus, was about where the Rue Soufflot is today. You can see the arena to the east, which is one of the few Roman remains in Paris to survive. This is the way the Paris arena looks today. It is said that it would hold 5,000 people. Hadrian also crossed the Channel to visit Britain, and this is a model of what was one of the finest Roman villas there at the time. It's at Fishbourne, just outside Chichester on the south coast. Obviously, some people in Britain were living very well by this time, after about a century of Roman occupation and influence. Here's another apparently Roman temple in Chichester, which seems to have been dedicated to the god whose peculiar symbol is on the facade. There's been much scholarly debate about this. Some think his name was Big Maximus. Hadrian also ordered the building of the famous wall across Britain for 75 miles, from Tynemouth on the east to the Solway Firth on the west. The purpose of this was, more or less, to separate the more civilized Roman part of Britain to the south from the uncivilized part, Scotland, to the north. Samuel Johnson in the 18th century said he still considered that to be its function. It may be that its real purpose wasn't so much military as economic, to control and tax trade, but it seems pretty formidable to have been intended as essentially just some sort of customs barrier. Here are the ruins at Housesteads, one of the forts built along it. It does seem that it was usually manned not by regular troops, but auxiliaries in any case. The 2nd century Roman historian Tacitus was inclined to romanticize the savage Britons and Germans living the free and natural life in the unpolluted wilderness. Sometimes he sounds almost like Rousseau or some modern Green Party candidate. But in this connection, it's good to remember what Kenneth Clark says. Those who prefer barbarism to civilization haven't given barbarism a long enough test yet. In any case, he puts a speech into the mouth of a Briton named Calgacus that's certainly very critical of Roman policy. This is another view of the wall, and he has Calgacus say now, "We, the last men on earth, the last of the free, have been shielded till today by the very remoteness and seclusion for which we're famed. But today the boundary of Britain is exposed. Beyond us lies no nation, nothing but waves and rocks, and the Romans more deadly still than they, for you will find in them an arrogance which no reasonable submission can elude. They're the brigands of the world. They're unique in being as violently tempted to attack the poor as the wealthy. Robbery, butchery, and rapine these liars call empire. They create a desert and call it peace." That last line is sometimes still quoted in Latin, "Solitudinem faciant pacem appellant." They create a desert and call it peace. That's pretty harsh, but Tacitus does also say that in his day he could think as he pleased and say what he thought, and he apparently wasn't punished for this kind of invective. Hadrian apparently did not visit Spain on the same trip as that on which he visited Gaul and Britain in the early 120s, but he was born in Spain, as I said, so he did spend some time there, and there are about as many Roman remains in Spain as in any country outside Italy. It has one of the most impressive aqueducts the Romans ever built in Segovia here. Here's a closer view of it. As I said, Trajan and Hadrian were both born in Spain, and also the parents of Marcus Aurelius, about whom we'll hear shortly, were from Spain, and next week we'll get to the Emperor Theodosius, who was a Spaniard by birth. Hadrian also visited North Africa, this time taking an army with him to suppress a rebellion, and he may well have visited Timgad, which you see here. It's thought to have been planned as a sort of retirement community for Roman army veterans in Trajan's day. The idea was that if you served for 30 years in the army, you could retire with the support of the government, but exactly how this worked isn't clear. It's about 75 miles from the coast, which is to say in the middle of nowhere. But like similar modern retirement communities, it was probably called something like Tuscany Estates or Canterbury Acres, or one of my favorites, Vista del Nada. Okay, that's the end of Part A. After the break, we'll follow Hadrian off to the east to visit Greece and Asia Minor